Panasonic, the heart of your system.
Hi guys, it's Silas for Kit Guru, and today we are taking a look at the CoolerMaster MA410M cooler. So let's start with the basics. The MasterAir MA410M is a very funky dual 120mm air CPU cooler from CoolerMaster with a bunch of interesting features to justify its £59.99 price point. For starters, the cooler's appearance is heavily beefed up with the inclusion of air guide armour, which is designed to help direct air across the aluminium fins and reduce dead heat spots. Not only does it make the cooler look a lot more serious than most aluminium coolers, but it also has been loaded with 28 addressable RGB LEDs. The two included and pre-installed 4-pin PWM 120mm fans also feature addressable RGB LEDs and are installed in a push-pull configuration. The fans themselves are also specifically push and pull with different blade designs. The heatsink itself features a central cutout to help with heat dissipation and LED illumination, as well as a thermal sensor mounted in the base of the cooler, something I can honestly say I've never seen before in an air cooler. In the box we find the cooler pretty much all set up with the two 120mm fans built onto the cooler as standard, warranty information and an installation guide, and an accessories box with current Intel and AMD mounts, alongside quite a few older sockets as well. A number of cables are also included for connecting everything up, and there's a braided 4-pin PWM extension cable for the two included fans, a SATA to 4-pin proprietary connection and temp sensor connection, a 5-pin proprietary to two addressable RGB connections, one for Gigabyte boards and the second for ASRock, Asus and MSI motherboards, and a small RGB controller are also included. This controller is a nice addition and pretty essential if you're looking to use the MA410M in a system where the motherboard doesn't support an addressable RGB header. One cool feature of this controller I completely noticed by accident is that it has a magnet built into the case, which allows it to be pretty easily attached to the rear of your case motherboard tray. Unfortunately, our CPU cooler test setup's motherboard doesn't include an RGB header or an addressable one, so I can only report on the LED functionality supported by this controller. But as the cooler supports MSI, ASRock, Asus and Gigabyte motherboards, you shouldn't have any trouble syncing up with programs like Asus Aura Sync and Gigabyte RGB Fusion. The rather odd assortment of cables did strike me as potentially a bit daunting for a first-time builder, but the time spent on installation will to a degree depend on how good CoolerMaster's instructions are for the MasterAir MA410M. The cooler itself feels pretty solid. Although the armour covering the heatsink is plastic, there is a little wiggle and movement with the housing, but I can't see this being an issue in the long run. Plastic did also seem like an odd choice, as this may help lock in heat around the cooler. Whether or not this is the case will become apparent in our testing. I also appreciate that a metal shroud would have driven up the price, and as it does stand, the MA410M does strike me as a pretty feature-rich option for the £59.99 asking price. Off the bat, I will say that the MasterAir MA410M shares the same mounting mechanism as a lot of other CoolerMaster coolers I've installed in the past, and from the get-go it immediately struck me as a bit of an unnecessarily overcomplicated process. Initially, when unboxing the MA410M, it was quite nice to see that the cooler came fully assembled in all its glory. However, the first stage of installation is to actually remove both the fans. After removing the 8 screws that hold the fans on, the next stage is to prep the backplate by fitting 4 flat ended screws and clip on the plastic screw covers. These are more intended to hold the screws in place, as the backplate is plastic. There are no issues with it touching the rear of the board compared to, say, a metal backplate. With the backplate in place, there are 4 standoffs that need to be installed on the top of the board, and conveniently a small tool is included to allow these standoffs to be installed with a standard screwdriver. Setting up the top retention bracket is probably the fiddliest part, as you first need to scooch it through the gap between the main body of the CPU cooler and CPU block. This is made a little bit trickier as the thermal sensor cable is mounted in the CPU block, and it does appear a little fragile, best not to snag it. The bracket then needs to be opened and locked to fit your socket, as well as adjusting the 4 retention screws to match. The bracket also features a small peg to help you align it, and once in place this can be positioned over the cooler, over the CPU, and then tighten the retention screws. Cabling is next and requires connecting the 2 fans to the 4-pin splitter and then to your motherboard CPU fan header. It's worth noting that the included controller doesn't have any control of fan speeds. The temp sensor can be connected to the first proprietary adapter connection to the controller itself, Then you connect the addressable RGB connector from the cooler to the controller and then to your motherboard. The SATA power cable also needs to be plugged in for the controller to receive power. Overall, I can't say I found the process super easy, even starting with taking the fans off the cooler. The whole process took around 20 minutes for me to complete, but I genuinely think for a first-time builder, they would probably struggle. Installation of the MA410M is definitely an area I think that could be improved, making it a little bit easier. With the cooler installed, it's on to testing. At KitGuru, we have recently updated our testing setup and now test temperatures on the more recent Z170 platform. For CPU, we are testing with the Intel Core i7-7700K installed in an Asus Z170 Pro gaming motherboard. For RAM, we have a single 8GB stick of Guile Evo X RGB for some added bling running at 3200 MHz. And storage is handled by a 120GB SanDisk SSD Plus. Powering our bench is a Seasonic Prime Platinum 650W PSU. This does also mean that we don't have as much comparison data, but we have run through a few coolers to provide an idea of where the MasterAir MA410M sits compared to the competition. When testing, we take a number of readings with both the i7-7700K's turbo locked and overclocked to 4.5 GHz. The temperatures taken are delta T values, meaning we subtract the ambient temperature from the CPU temperature. More details of our full testing methodology can be found on kitguru.net. So the testing results were really not what I expected. In almost all instances, the MA410M performed worse than the MA410P, a single fan cooler. I repeated testing on both coolers, and even after multiple passes, the results were pretty much the same, with only minor differences of a degree or so. In delving through the specs pages for both coolers further, there are some differences, namely being the higher RPM, static pressure and airflow of the single fanned MA410P. You do see instances of push-pull configurations not providing a massive decrease in temperature, so it is possible that the rear fan of the MA410M is a little wasted. The MA410M is one of the quietest coolers that we tested on our new test bench though, so although a little bit hotter, you are saving on audible noise. The outer air guide armour was also very hot to the touch during stress tests, so this could be retaining hotter air in parts and preventing air and heat from dissipating from the heatsink passively. These results are quite interesting, as when you take away the fans and air guide armour, the main heatsink body is exactly the same size as the MasterAir MA410P at 60 by 116 by 158.5mm, but also with a section cut from the middle. This being said, if you consider the single fan MasterAir MA410P is available for around £35, I can see the added value of the extra fan, in my opinion better looks, and a temperature sensor for the extra £25. The sacrifice being, however, that you could experience very slightly higher temperatures. The lighting, although a bit complicated to set up and plug together, does work well. It would, however, have been nice to see all these separate cables, if they're all required anyway, to be bundled or sleeved into one cable to help with cable management. Lighting is sharp and bright and would do a really solid job of lighting up the inside of your system. One downside I found is that the included RGB controller is a little bit limited when it comes to modes. It has all of your traditional rainbow spectrum, breathing, strobing and the temperature mode, but there is no option for selecting just one colour in these modes. It's all colours or nothing basically. This being said, I think there is far more potential to be unlocked if you connect directly to an addressable RGB header on your motherboard, and I would almost be inclined to say that this is essential to make full use of this cooler's addressable RGB element. It's worth bearing this in mind to avoid disappointment if you do want to set the cooler's LEDs to one particular colour. To summarise, as it stands, it's a little tricky to say whether the MasterAir MA410M is a good cooling solution. The installation process really needs to be improved, but to an extent most people are unlikely to keep removing and reinstalling their cooler, so thankfully you do only have to do this once. Personally, I really like the aesthetic and the all blacked out look. It does look a lot more premium than a standard aluminium air cooler, and it's much more likely to look at home in your system. The temperatures when compared to some budget CoolerMaster coolers are not ideal. It doesn't really justify the higher price tag from a performance perspective. When looking at other coolers, both air and liquid are available within or around the £60 price point. There's a lot of competition which would likely offer better performance. Even CoolerMaster themselves produce 120mm liquid coolers with RGB, albeit not addressable RGB lighting, which can be purchased now for roughly the same price. Performance is basically on par with the MA410P, but the addition of an extra fan, better lighting and an overall better aesthetic incur a higher price point. Really, to me, the key audience for the MasterAir MA410M are those looking for an air cooler to go alongside their RGB decked out system, but if this is the case, a motherboard that supports an addressable RGB header is essential, as the standard controller is pretty limited. Make sure you like this video if you liked it, and don't forget to hit subscribe for future videos. If you don't want to miss the next video, feel free to click the bell icon below for notifications of new video releases from Kit Guru. I've been Silas for Kit Guru, and I will see you in the next one.